Have you ever noticed that something about Madame Gazelle just doesn't add up? On the surface, she's the perfect teacher, calm, patient, always ready with the lesson. But once you start paying attention, the show drops little clues that don't make sense, unless she's hiding a much darker secret. Why does she never seem to age, even though she's taught multiple generations? Why does she disappear in mirrors during Halloween? And why is Mr. Bull, who doesn't even have a child in her class, always coincidentally around whenever something unusual happens at school? A lot of people write these off as silly cartoon jokes, but when you line them up, a picture forms Madame Gazelle might actually be a vampire. If that's true, then Peppa, George, and especially the newest baby, Evie Pig, might be in danger. Let's go step by step and look at the strongest clues hiding in plain sight. Let's start with the scene that hooks everyone. The Halloween episode, Pumpkin Party. Susie Sheep is dressed as a vampire and chats with Madame Gazelle right in front of a mirror. Susie's reflection is clear. Madame Gazelle's is missing. The show even draws attention to it, almost nudging viewers to notice. That's one of the oldest tells in vampire lore. No reflection, it's not subtle, and it's not a background gag, it's front and center. Then Gazelle casually says Susie's costume reminds her of her old hometown. That line sounds harmless until you remember where the most famous vampire stories come from. If her nostalgia points to somewhere like Transylvania, that's not just a cute quip, that's a breadcrumb. Question for you: if your kid's teacher joked that vampire costumes reminded her of home, would you shrug it off, or would you start watching a little closer? Jump to sun, sea, and snow. The town plans a beach day, but a snowstorm hits the night before. The water is freezing. Everyone hesitates, except Madame Gazelle. She walks straight into the icy sea and stays there comfortably. Mummy Pig tries, bolts out shivering, and gives up. Gazelle, calm and steady. For a supposedly elderly teacher, that reaction makes no sense. For a vampire, creatures often described as cold-blooded and unaffected by temperature, it fits perfectly. Was that just cartoon silliness? Or another deliberate tick mark on the vampire checklist? Now the age question. In Time Capsule, we learn Madame Gazelle once taught Peppa's parents when they were children. Decades later, she's teaching their kids, and looks exactly the same. No wrinkles, no change in energy, same calm face. In Madame Gazelle's house, she mentions planting a pine tree when she was already older. Pine trees take decades to grow to the size we see. The tree is massive, and she hasn't aged. That timeline simply doesn't work for a normal human. Then there's her husband. A portrait at her house shows a dignified figure in a suit and top hat. In a museum, he appears in an old military uniform from a couple centuries ago. If he's important enough to be commemorated in that era's attire and still tied to Gazelle's present-day life, it hints at a lifespan that stretches far beyond normal. Is the show telling us she's lived through multiple eras unchanged? In Bat and Ball, Madame Gazelle steps up for a friendly baseball lesson. She swings once, and the ball rockets up a hill, hits the school roof, and bounces back to the field. That isn't good form, that's raw power. Even athletic adults would struggle to reproduce that hit, let alone someone portrayed as elderly. Peppa asks if she's too old for this, and Gazelle answers, "I'll never be too old." That line lands differently if you think about immortality. If you don't age, you don't slow down. And if you don't slow down, feats like this stop being jokes and start looking like signals. Back to wild flowers. The class spots a plant that smells like home cooking, and Madame Gazelle quickly points out it's garlic, then immediately distances herself, saying she doesn't like it. Most people either like or dislike garlic, but the way the scene plays feels more like avoidance than taste. Garlic is one of the most consistent vampire repellents in folklore. It's in stories from all over the world, so why call out that specific plant in a kid's show and pair it with Gazelle's sudden discomfort? Here's where Mr. Bull comes in. In that same episode, he shows up and tags along to learn. Across the series, he always seems to be around the school, even though he doesn't have a child enrolled. Fans read that as protection. Either he's suspicious of Gazelle, or he knows exactly what she is. Some even think he planted garlic in the garden to weaken her. So is Mr. Bull a clumsy builder, or the quiet guardian keeping a very old threat in check? Madame Gazelle's house looks like a fun episode about a crooked home, until you watch the details. First, Peppa and George slide because the floor is tilted one way. A moment later, in another room, the floor tilts the opposite way. If a tree is pushing the house from one side, you shouldn't get contradictory tilts in different rooms like that. That feels less like structural damage and more like a space that doesn't follow normal rules, like a lair or a castle with shifting geometry. Add the decades-old cracks that haven't caused a collapse, plus the ancient tree supposedly responsible, and you're looking at a house that seems to be held together by something other than good carpentry. Would you step inside if you knew the floors pick their own angles? Madame Gazelle has 3 sisters, known as the Rock Gazelles. The number alone is a wink for anyone who knows Dracula. 3 vampire brides, always 3. It lines up a little too neatly to be random. Pair that with her husband's count-like look in the portrait, and the museum's historical uniform. If you read the show's visual language, literally, her family looks like aristocratic immortals who've been around for generations. The sisters' presence turns Gazelle from a lone oddball into part of a possible vampire clan, quiet, organized, and hiding in plain sight. If the sisters are in town, what else do they know, and how much influence do they have? The part that worries parents in these theory videos, Evie Pig, the newest baby. In folklore, vampires are often drawn to babies innocent, defenseless, and easy to isolate from protection, like garlic or vigilant adults. If Mr. Bull has been the informal bodyguard at school who's watching Evie at home, Garlic can't realistically be everywhere, and Evie can't speak up for herself. If Madame Gazelle is what the clues suggest, does she respect boundaries, or is she simply waiting for an opportunity? If you were Peppa's parents, would you feel confident leaving Evie near Gazelle, or would you start putting garlic by the windows just in case? A quick thought experiment. The school roof seems to need fixing more than it should, and Mr. Bull often prolongs those jobs. If he's suspicious of Gazelle staying nearby under the cover of maintenance, keeps him close to the children. It also gives him plausible reasons to monitor the grounds, the garden, and who comes and goes. It's a stretch, but consider the pattern when Gazelle is around. He's around. Is he just accident-prone or deliberately sticking close? Isn't this just a kids' show gag? That's the most common pushback. True, Peppa Pig is full of playful moments, but some of these clues are so specific to vampire tradition, mirror, garlic, agelessness, that stacking them together starts to look intentional. What about the house? Cartoons bend physics, absolutely, but the show often grounds the world in simple logic kids can follow. When it intentionally breaks that logic, it usually does so for a reason, often to hint, nudge, or set up a joke. Here, the breaks line up with classic vampire imagery. Add it all up, the missing reflection, the cold resistance, the ageless timeline, the garlic avoidance, the impossible house, the count-like husband, the 3 sisters, and the constant presence of Mr. Bull. On their own, each is a curiosity. Together, they tell a story. Madame Gazelle isn't just a teacher, she's a carefully hidden vampire living in plain sight. Which brings us back to the real concern, is Evie Pig safe? If Mr. Bull is the quiet protector, he may need to watch more than just the school. If you want to keep pulling this thread, the next mystery is a big one.